Greetings. Let's spend a little bit of time on Chapter 3, General Characteristics of Crime and Criminals. And I would first say, if I got $1 for every time I heard a wrong presentation or inaccurate presentation of crime statistics in the media, in the newspaper, or in the general public, or by some politician, I could buy a bunch of large Starbucks coffee and still have a little bit of change to afford a sandwich. In other words, there's a lot of misrepresentation of data out there, and we hear that especially around political campaigns, or, for example, one crime occurs in a neighborhood with a relatively low crime rate and becomes very noticeable or popular in that neighborhood, and the discussion focuses on that crime. It appears that crime is bad, or there may be two crimes in a very low area, and then all of a sudden we see, well, there's a so-called crime wave when there really isn't. What seems to be the case is that we've seen some major declines in crime since the 1980s. So there's a lot of variation, and that's important to take into account. And also we see a lot of problems in interpreting the data. Some things we have to look at when we're talking about crime, for example, will be the source of information. Are we using uniform crime reports, which are crimes reported to police? Are we using victimization studies where samples of people in different communities are asked about crime victimization? What are the types of crimes that are of interest? One of the things we have to be very careful of is when the whole crime rate's kind of put together, and we might hear that crime increased or crime rate decreased, but if we don't separate out property crimes and violent crimes, that can be misleading and lead to greater fears. For example, if the violent crime rate went down and the property crime rate went up more, so then we might see someone saying, well, the crime rate went up, but I think that people would be more desirable, of course, to see crime go down all around, but people probably would be feeling okay about violent crime rates decreasing while property crimes increase than the opposite. We see that situation occurring. And of course, the definitions of crime sometimes get confusing, and the quality of the data that's collected, and how that information is collected and then disseminated to the population. Of course, arrest rates can be related to how law enforcement addresses certain crimes or specific crimes. For example, I've talked to law enforcement officers before that will tell me very different, perceptions of crime problems than what community politicians or representatives are saying. So there may be disconnect there as well. And some may see certain crimes as worse than others, and so there's always, a public social ranking in that sense. There may be the so-called discovery of new crimes where it's been, a problem all along. There may be situations where policies were passed that were not thought out in terms of future implications, and we see an increase in problems such as the opioid epidemic that has seemed to occurred in the 2016, 2015, 2017 time period. So how does the United States compare to other countries? What we find is that it depends on the particular crime that we're talking about. If we're comparing to other industrialized high-tech countries, for example, the murder and rape rate are higher in the United States, but we see, for example, assault, burglary, robbery, and vehicle theft is lower in the United States than other countries such as England and Wales. So it really depends on the time period and the countries being compared And also we have to consider how those countries collect data and the quality. So the same quality assurances would hold for other countries as well. One of the things your author points out is that there's a tendency for people to incorrectly believe that crime is worse than it has been in the past. And again, I mentioned that we saw some really significant declines in crime since the 1980s. If we're going to go back that far to look and do comparative analysis, and so that's important to consider. There's also a variety of factors that are related to trends in crime. For example, the age composition of a community or population. What we find in general is that crime commission declines with age. So juveniles, for example, are more likely to be arrested for robbery and property crimes, and we see that people between the ages of 18 and 34 in general are more likely to be arrested for violent crime. And then of course you would see that white collar crime, you would find older individuals engaging or being arrested for that activity, primarily because one needs to age into a profession and get to a point where they're in a position to commit white collar crime, and that can take a while. Desistance is the process of aging out of crime, and that's one of the major trends we see, that people just tend to age out, burn out, or desist from crime as they age. And some explanations for that is that there's an increase in social bonds, there's greater access to legitimate activities, and there's also decreased access to illegitimate opportunities, and also the costs, personal and social costs, increase. And certainly, people that age may have less energy to commit crimes and less interest in committing crimes. And so we see a variety of factors going on there. One of the interesting features that your author points out is that most adult offenders had been juvenile offenders, but most juvenile offenders do not go on to become adult offenders. So knowing that information basically tells us that we really need to focus on helping and assisting and rehabilitating juvenile delinquents, juvenile offenders, and preventing them from becoming adult offenders. So we really need to focus on that in greater detail in our research and in our policy and our actual practices. Gender is considered the best predictor of crime across time and place, and so for example, that vast majority of those arrested in the United States are males, and so we can look at some explanations of that as well, related to socialization and expectations, and how certain crimes are viewed as related to gender and how they're treated in the criminal justice system. Also, it's pointed out that some criminological theories have a androcentric or have a male centered bias, and so that's important to realize as well. Also, social class is related to crime, and for example, there is a higher arrest rate based on lower socioeconomic status, and a lot of that may be related to lack of power, the types of crime, the policing of crime, lack of the ability to hire a private attorney, and also increased risk of being prosecuted. Also, race and crime is very relevant to study as well. Again, we've seen racial biases in a variety of areas. One that we've talked about for many years was when crack cocaine was penalized much more harshly than powder cocaine. And so we start thinking about how race plays a role in criminal justice policy, and how there may be inherent biases, especially when race and socioeconomic status intersect. And so again, if we want to solve a lot of problems, we have to focus on building cohesion and self-efficacy in communities that have high crime rates. Immigration and crime, another hot topic, and of course you'll see there's a lot of myths related to immigration and crime. One thing that your author points out is that first-generation immigrants tend to have lower rates of offending, while second-generation tend to have higher rates of offending. So, think about that for a moment, the socialization process and how that's related to a variety of factors that we'll be studying in the future. There's also regional variation, and we see a lot of debate about that, especially when we start comparing communities, for example, at the city or the county level. And I can tell you I've gotten in those debates before regarding the crime rates, and again, all those factors are thrown in about quality of data, what's collected, arrest rates, community focus on specific crimes, and so on. I've been told by some community officials some pretty interesting things about crime and crime rates in their own communities, but sometimes we don't have a very accurate assessment, especially if there's some hidden crimes that we don't know about. I'll go back to that. For example, in one city official once told me that there was no prostitution in his city, none at all. And of course, my question is that accurate, or it's just that prostitution is not something that is publicly seen as a problem, or there are no arrests, for example, for prostitution. Now that may be an accurate statement if he was to say that there were no arrests for prostitution in my city last year. I can agree with that, but to simply say there's no prostitution, how would he know that? And of course, when he says that, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of people in the community that are going to come out and say, nonsense. You're not going to have some community member come out and say, I was with a prostitute, the other night in this city, and so there is. You're not going to find that for obvious reasons. And so there's also, that social aspect in looking at crime rates and discussing. And I'm more of the problem-solving type that, I want to see crime decrease, but one of and focus specifically on how we can do that. We have to understand the crime problem, but sometimes cities will try to hide it or push it away, and certainly I don't want to be seen in a negative way by any city chamber of commerce. I want, and so you get into those debates. One of the very well-known one was, I think it was back in, the 90s already, where there were some tourist shootings in Miami, and it made the front cover of many magazines and newspapers. It was on Time magazine, front page news, and Miami really had a tough time, trying to convince the public that it was a safe place to visit. All I know is I was going to a conference, a social problems conference back then in the 90s, into Miami around that time, and a couple things I noticed. The first thing is when I was crossing the bridge, they were pulling a body out of the water, and that was from a homicide, which I found out was a domestic homicide later on when I was talking to a law enforcement officer at the conference. And so that kind of right there, I said, my gosh, that's, must be extremely dangerous. In the middle of the day, I see the homicide investigation going on off to the side in the water. But then when I got to the hotel, there were security guards all over the place. That I don't think I've ever seen so much security at in a city like that at that particular time, and that whole violent, dangerous scenario dissipated in the next year or two, and I don't think it's really come back in the public eye. And so, of course, we want to really ask what was happening at that time, and did we see this huge increase in crime, or were there just a few things that occurred that became very public? Your author talks about institutions in crime, social institutions, or those stable social patterns that help society function. For example, the educational system, the family, religion, the economy, the mass media. And there's some information about crime and family. For example, they state that child abuse, neglect, and inconsistent discipline are positively correlated to delinquency, meaning that the chances of juvenile delinquency are higher among those that were abused, neglected, or experienced inconsistent discipline. What the research does show is there is that relationship, but the difference is relatively small, probably much smaller than the public perceives, based on Professor Whittam's research on looking at the long-term effects of child abuse and neglect. Education is inversely related. That means as education levels go up, crime commissions go down, and a lot of that's probably related to social class and opportunities. We mentioned that before. Obviously, education and socioeconomic status are tightly bound. Also, religion. Crime rates vary by religious affiliation, but your author believes that a lot of that is an effect of social class. And there's a lot of debate if religion can act as a buffer for crime. And, a lot of times I'll say it would depend. The economy is mentioned, that property crimes that also involve violence are more likely to occur during times of economic depression. And also, they point out that during major wars, domestic crime rates tend to decline. And there's a lot of debate about the effects of war before, during, and after. The mass media, there's a lot of debate about does violence in the media increase violent crime, or have minimal effects or no effects, or does it decrease violent crime? So they have the catharsis hypothesis and the precipitation hypothesis, and also the ideas about copycat crime. So you can read about that. The catharsis is sort of that exposure to violence in the media helps people to let off steam and reduces the likelihood of violence, while the precipitation hypothesis is that exposure to media violence increases the likelihood of violence. So you have two interesting contradictory theories right there. So again, to kind of sum up, we must use great caution in interpreting crime rate in data and statements, and especially when comparing with within a region or even across regions, certainly, and also in looking at trends in crime and some of the factors related to crimes. That we always have some things included, but we always have other things excluded, and so a lot of times you'll find that we find that there are some relationships related to certain criminal patterns, but then there's also a good chunk of unexplained variance, or really what we don't know that's going on. So we don't have these perfect theories that completely explain crime. We have a lot of partial theories in that sense, or we might have complete theories but partially explain crime patterns and trends. So listen to what is going on out there in your community, in the media, and see how it relates to these crime patterns and trends. And also look for when you kind of hear those myths about different crime rates or crimes or misinformation, or someone using one particular crime to make it seem like there's a crime wave when there really isn't, and so on. And this wraps up this video.